I am assuming that everybody can see the screen there right now, and that folks will jump in. Great, that sounds good, and that you're able to hear me fairly clearly as well. So let me actually just begin by emphasizing, as Sam mentioned, these slides will be available to you through a link, and they'll be on our website. I couldn't resist posting that picture. I just came across it recently. It's from Life magazine, and it's of how they used to do presentations at NASA. And so for all of us who have grown to sort of have a love-hate relationship with PowerPoint, I thought that picture captures how, in some sense, it really does represent progress. I also wanted an excuse to show this picture, which doesn't convey any of the content we'll be talking about, but hopefully does convey that we're really, really interested in your comments and questions, and if we don't have time to get to all of them during this webinar, I read all of them. We aren't necessarily able to respond to all of them, but they're invaluable, because as we'll be talking about today, what I'll be sharing with you is a new framework for thinking about and working to strengthen developmental relationships in kids' lives, between adults and kids, and between kids and other kids, that we have developed over the last year and a half at Search Institute. Our first major study of developmental relationships is ongoing and will be released in the fall. But we've chosen to share this version of the framework in advance of the study release, because we really hope that over time this will become a way that we can talk about and think about and ultimately act upon relationships across the diverse settings that are represented by participants in this webinar in new ways. And so this very much is a work in progress, and we invite your thoughts. Just very briefly to underscore why this is important. We know that in the 21st century, which is now so old, we probably should stop referring to the 21st century as some kind of a new paradigm. But the kids are realizing dramatically differential outcomes over the course of their education and development. If you take those 10 kids, we know that about 2.5 of them, if we could divide a kid in half, are not going to graduate from high school. We know that about half of them are not going to go on to any post-secondary education. We know that 7 out of the 10 are going to fail to complete post-secondary education. Educational success, of course, is not the only goal we have for young people as they grow and develop, but it's an increasingly relevant one in a global information age. And so the question that I think keeps a lot of us up at night and has a lot of us going into our places of work every day is, what are we going to do to put all young people on a path to thriving, not just to surviving, to flourishing and not just to getting by, and especially making sure that no young person falls through the cracks. And the good news is that over the last couple decades, we have begun to put a lot of pieces of that puzzle in place. And we could spend an entire webinar on every one of these pieces of the puzzle. But you can see that we've begun investing early, we've begun raising academic expectations, we've begun thinking about leveraging technology and recognizing the role of race and culture. We've tried test-based accountability and are beginning to think about engaging parents and families. There's a movement for collective impact and out-of-school time, and very recently a new emphasis on social and emotional learning, and of course using data to make decisions. Now, I could have added another 30 pieces to that puzzle, and I'm sure I'm missing some big ones. But in our view at Search Institute, the piece of the puzzle that actually matters for all of those that I've got listed and many others besides is relationships. Now, to some extent, someone at a research to practice organization that focuses on youth and kids, highlighting the importance of relationships may seem like a blinding flash of the obvious. We've all known that relationships matter for a long time, and when I was an administrator in an urban school district, we used to talk all the time about rigor, relevance, and relationships. But despite the widely acknowledged importance of relationships in kids' lives, there really is a mountain of evidence to suggest that not enough kids are experiencing those relationships, they're not experiencing them intensively enough, and the relationships don't always have the right ingredients to help kids develop successfully. Here's just one data point that undergirds that, that assertion. It's from a study that Search Institute did in 2011 with a very large sample of adolescents in the country, and we can see that kids felt quite good about their relationships within their family when they were asked about family support in general. But when we got specific and asked about positive ways of communicating in their family, that plummeted to 32%. We can see that the good news is half of the kids in that large 90,000 young person sample felt they had close relationships with an adult outside their family, but that also means that 50% didn't. 40% felt that they lived in a caring neighborhood, and only 35% felt that they were living in a caring school climate. Still fewer felt that their parents were building relationships with their school. So in a day when we've come to talk often about the achievement gap and the opportunity gap, I think this slide and many others you're probably familiar with underscore the fact that we really have a relationship gap. Now, the problem with the picture I just put on the screen is actually not that it is bacon-flavored toothpaste, though I would not particularly myself choose to buy bacon-flavored toothpaste. The problem is, and I did read the product ingredients on that novelty item, there's no fluoride in that toothpaste. And two researchers previously at the University of Pittsburgh came up with, I think, a really nice way of conceptualizing the role of relationships in young people's development. And they called it the active ingredient. In the same way that you need yeast to bake bread, or you need sodium fluoride for toothpaste to have the cavity-fighting properties that are the real reason you use it. You can get everything else right. You can get the content of your program right, the content of your Sunday school program right, or youth ministry for those of you who are in faith-based settings, or of course in the area I know best, the curriculum and the instruction within your school or district right. But if the relationships are not happening for kids in the ways that we're going to talk about them in this webinar, there's a lot of reason to think you're not going to get the outcomes that we're ultimately seeking. Now, I'm probably preaching to the choir with folks who come to a webinar in the middle of the day to talk about relationships, but let me very quickly give you some examples that I hope make the case that, in fact, the centrality of relationships to young people's development and educational success is a conclusive finding in research. And it's been proven to matter in a really striking array of areas that a lot of us focus on in our work with young people. So there's a study that we're conducting separately here at Search Institute looking at a large data set for a urban school district in the southwestern United States. And what we're finding there is very high correlations between young people's motivation, their self-confidence, their frequency with which they produce good study habits, their grades, and even their PSAT scores. And we look forward to sharing the results of that study in the near future. A separate study that we did a couple years ago, released in 2012, looked at the American family. And what we found there was that the character of the relationships and the ways people act on those relationships within families was a far better predictor of healthy development, both educationally and physically, than things like race and ethnicity, income, family structure, gender. To sort of paraphrase Bill Clinton back in the 90s with "It's the economy, stupid," that study really showed that it's the relationships, stupid. Not that anybody's stupid. Similarly, when we look at the effectiveness of programs, whether they're in schools or out of school time, there's also a large body of literature that concludes, as did this study by James Heckman and Tim Kautz at the University of Chicago, that the common feature of successful interventions across all stages of the life cycle through adulthood is that they promote attachment and provide a secure base for exploration and learning for the child. Successful interventions emulate the mentoring environments offered by successful families. I would add here that James Heckman is an economist who won the Nobel Prize for economics. He is a quantoid on steroids, so he follows the data. And here you see a really penultimate conclusion from his own looking at what works for young people. And it highlights attachment and secure base for exploration and learning, notably across all stages of the life cycle. So this sounds kind of early childhood, which is where Heckman's initial research has been tremendously influential. But his conclusion is 17-year-old high school boys need attachment just as much as 3-year-old kids in a child care program. Carol Dweck, Gregory Walton, and Jeffrey Cohen Dweck in particular, prominent name these days, highlight the importance of relationships in terms of schools and the perception that teachers care about you being really, really central. A lot of us are thinking a lot these days about boys and what's happening with our young men in an array of fields. Interesting study from two colleagues at the Center for Study of Boys and Girls' Lives who write, counter to cultural assumptions that boys are generally resistant to schooling, boys in our studies indicated remarkable acceptance of the value and necessity of their school programs. Resistance and opposition arise most commonly when boys are unable to establish positive relationships with teachers and other staff. And finally, the emphasis, which is, I think, productively growing all over the country these days on social and emotional skills. Two researchers at Harvard, I think, frame this nicely. Relationships are the soil in which children's emotional learning skills grow. And finally, relationships and resilience. These traumatic and very challenging circumstances that many of our young people find themselves in today are also best navigated when the young person feels supported by others, feels he or she has a safety net, feels high expectation from others around him or her. And when those things are in place, that young person is going to be more willing to actively embrace challenge and think creatively to solve problems. So all of these and many other examples I could have shared underscore the importance of relationships in rigorous research. But in some ways, we really don't need that research to bring us to this question of why relationships. I thought this article recently from Boston Globe magazine captured it nicely. Nearly every person I know has some version of this story, the moment when a teacher changes the course of your life. A good teacher, after all, wields the authority of a parent with none of the psychological baggage. The best of them are semi-mysterious figures whose wisdom seems boundless and whose approval helps us discover who we are. And I thought I would pull out one more quote from a blogger who actually is a teacher based in California that I think exemplifies exactly what the writer in the Boston Globe said. He was writing about his kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Martino, and he said, she was one of the most important and influential people in my life besides my parents. She was the one who noticed I was an awkward and insecure boy and made sure to remind me daily of how talented and beautiful I was. My success in life is directly related to the confidence this incredible woman instilled upon me during my most important years. This writer happens to be in his 30s now, and when you think about the fact that he is tracing his core sense of development to his kindergarten teacher, it really shows the lasting impact that developmental relationships can have on young people's lives. So to wind up this kind of long, but I think still pretty important entry point to the discussion of developmental relationships, I'd ask you to think about in your own life, who was a relationship that helped make you who you are, who helped you understand yourself, and who helped you envision who you wanted to be in the future. I will tell you, I was in California last week and did a workshop in the morning for a diverse group of people, very like the folks participating in this webinar. And when we posed that question to the group and began to unpack their responses, it was a fascinating conversation. The reason that we think it's important to take time understanding not just the importance of relationships, but applying it to ourselves, is that this is work we keep rushing past. We all acknowledge the centrality of relationships and then rush right to those other issues we talked about at the outset of program quality or content. As one informal test of that, I'd ask you to think about, when was the last time your organization or even your family had a formal meeting or some kind of gathering where relationships were the main reason you came together to talk and interact? Not talking about something else where relationships came up, but the primary purpose was understanding the relationships in kids' lives and working to strengthen them. I will tell you, having been an educator in different settings for 25 years, I can maybe recall one or two such focused discussions of relationships. It always came up. We never quite slowed down enough to really get into it. Now, a critical point here, though, for our work at Search Institute is not just to validate the fact that relationships matter. We know that for kids who are succeeding, the relationships very often go hand in hand with that success. We're after an understanding here of how, whether and if so, how relationships can be causal of good things in kids' lives. I picked this picture up because it's my favorite way of illustrating the dangers of confusing correlation and causation in education and youth development. If someone from outer space came and noticed that every time there's a fire, there's these guys with helmets and red trucks who show up, you might falsely conclude that it's the guys in red trucks and women in red trucks and helmets who cause fires. But of course that would be a false attribution of causation, and you would instead be calling something that's highly correlated something causal. Well, our premise is that actually building relationships with kids can be a causal factor. You can change a kid's life trajectory by strengthening or building those relationships in diverse settings: homes, out-of-school time programs, schools, and communities. And the research that we'll be doing in the years ahead using the framework that we'll turn to now is going to be dedicated, among other things, to testing the proposition that we can see Josh Shipp quoted there, articulating that every child is just one caring adult away from being a success story. So in order to actually begin getting relationships right, we've really got to open that black box to understand what's happening in those settings, like happened for the blogger whose quote I just, Nicholas Ferroni, read a moment ago, writing about Mrs. Martino, his kindergarten teacher. What was Mrs. Martino doing with those kindergartners that produced a life-transforming experience that has literally, in his case, lasted for decades? So our goal at Search Institute really is to go right into trying to work with others and of course, building on a large body of existing research to understand those relationships. How do we get here? Over the last year and a half, which is the length of my tenure at Search Institute, we've really done three things. One, we've looked at the research literature. Two, we've analyzed the mountain of data that we have here at Search Institute, primarily from our research over the last 25 years on developmental assets. And we've been out around the country talking to kids, talking to parents, teachers, and youth workers. And we basically, in a sophisticated focus group and interview protocol, asked people about the relationships in their lives and tried to unpack what made those powerful, transformative relationships, or for people who didn't have those relationships in their lives, what were the gaps that they wished had been filled and the implications. So let me give you two quick examples of the way we've leveraged previous Search Institute research and data to build the framework that I'll quickly walk you through in a moment. This is from a major study, a representative sample of American 15-year-olds about 2.5 years ago, and the question posed to the kids was, when an adult gets you, what do they do a lot? And of course, you can see right there at the top, again, maybe a blinding flash of the obvious, but really a powerful insight. 80% said they listen to me. And if you ask kids then, how often do you feel adults listen to you, it looks a heck of a lot different than 80%. It's a much, much lower rate. Honesty, dependability at 73% was something that came out really, really strongly in that study and others. I found the 71% who said they remember earlier talks to be really interesting. There's a sense that a lot of kids have, it's come out through our work, that every time they interact with an adult, but also to some extent their peers, they kind of go back to square one, that you're not connecting the dots across your interaction with me. And I know, having been a high school teacher with 183 kids at one time, it can be very hard to connect the dots across the many kids that you're working with and serving, but that when you do that, and we'll talk about this briefly later in the webinar, it sends powerful messages to the young person. Laughing at their jokes and setting high standards, I thought it was interesting that it was only 39% of the kids who said giving me privileges is what means that an adult really gets me. Doesn't mean that they don't want the privileges, but they're not confused about the fact that that means that this adult really understands who I am. Very briefly, one other data point that we've used in building the developmental relationships framework, it came from our family assets study a couple of years ago. And this slide really shows, I think, why we need to be very, very intentional and careful in listening to young people's perceptions of the relationships in their lives. Here you can see we asked parents, how comfortable do you feel talking about these subjects with your kid? And then we ask the children of those parents, how comfortable do you feel talking about these subjects? And you can see here in every case there's a big discrepancy between what young people felt comfortable talking about with the adult and what the parent of that kid thought the young person would feel comfortable talking about. And so this really, I think, reminds us that if we're going to be serious about strengthening relationships in young people's lives, we can't presume that we accurately perceive their experience of those relationships, in particular because we are actors in them, and so we're not neutral parties. Whew. Okay, so here's how we've conceptualized to date what we're calling a developmental relationship. It's a close connection that powerfully and positively shapes young people's identities and helps them develop a thriving mindset. I think the idea of identity is a relatively familiar one. It certainly is highly developed in the research literature. By a thriving mindset, it's a term that comes out of other work we're doing here at Search Institute that really, to summarize a pretty complex set of attitudes and behaviors, can be summarized as the idea that I'm not just going to survive in life, I'm going to thrive. I'm not just going to get by, I'm going to flourish. And that when a young person has developed that kind of mindset, even though they may face extraordinary challenges in life, it is a really fundamental turning point, which doesn't mean they're guaranteed to succeed, but which is a fundamental difference from a young person who hasn't developed that kind of thriving mindset. In the historical book that Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote about Abraham Lincoln that some of you may have read, called Team of Rivals, this quote from a letter that Lincoln wrote in 1855 to a young law student jumped out at me along these lines. Lincoln, the law student asked Lincoln, who was just coming to national prominence as an extraordinary self-made man who had grown up in a log cabin and had become a successful lawyer and, of course, was on his way to becoming president. He said, "What should I do to prepare in life?" And Lincoln gave the law student some other advice, but then he said, basically, more than all of this, your own resolution to succeed is more important than any other one thing. And the reason I like this quote is actually the last part. It's more important than any other one thing. A lot of the discussion that I think we're having in the worlds of education youth development about ideas like grit and perseverance and motivation could almost be taken to assume that if a kid has a fire in the belly, they've made it, and that nothing's going to get in their way, and all of these other obstacles are just mountains to successfully climb. And of course that's a wonderful narrative, and there are cases of kids that really do it. But I think it's very important, especially for young people living in our most challenging circumstances, to remember that there are just point of fact obvious obstacles to success that we need to help them remove, that come from poverty and come from other challenges, or we, meaning the big we, need to help them remove. And so motivation and grit are necessary but not sufficient. But what Lincoln here says is that if you added all of those other things up, good and bad, cumulatively they might get in your way and either mean that you're going to be on the path to success in life and it's hard to stop you, or it's going to be really, really tough to get on the right road. But more important than any one of those things is resolution to succeed. And the question that I would pose for all of you who are working with kids or raising kids, how intentionally are you seeking to build young people's resolution to succeed in life? Now, I don't have a simple playbook for you to do that, but we know part of the answer is relationships, and giving us a common way to think, talk, and act talk about, and act upon relationships is the strategic focus of our work at Search Institute in the years ahead. If you go to our website, on the front page you can download a one-pager that gives you a summary of the developmental relationships framework. We would be grateful if you share it, and we are very eager for your feedback on it. It is being tested by our first major study of developmental relationships in families, which will be released in the fall. For those of you who know Search Institute, this work really builds upon our previous research on the developmental assets, which were 40 different factors that correlate with young people's success both inside and outside school. And so I won't go into developmental assets at this point, except to say that for those of you who know that work, just as the developmental assets gave us a language and a framework and measures to think about developing the whole child, internally and externally, we're hoping the developmental relationships framework gives us a language to talk about, think about, and act upon in understanding those powerful relational interactions between kids and adults and kids and their peers. So 5 big factors came out of our work on developmental relationships. The first is expressing care. The old saying is really, really true. People don't care what you know until they know that you care. And the kids said that to us, and it came out in the data again and again. But one of the things that we've concluded from this work is that caring is necessary but not sufficient, and that when we describe the role of engaging with young people as simply being a caring adult, we miss some other really, really important parts of a developmental relationship, one of which is challenging growth, the second of which is giving support, the fourth of which is sharing power, and then finally expanding possibility. So these are our big 5, and through the study that we're doing now, we'll see if all 5 emerge from the new data as either important or equally important. At this point, though, we're seeing them as very dynamic, that the 5 things all show up in a developmental relationship at some point in some way, but they do so dynamically. So there's no sort of simple formula of 30% caring, 20% challenge, 20% support that I wish I could give to folks, but if I did, none of you would buy it, of course, because this is never going to be, we can create ways to think more clearly about relationships, but we're never going to find ways to sort of strengthen them through off-the-shelf packaged programming. This graph is attempted to capture the relationship between just 2 of those 5 components of a developmental relationship, challenge and support. And it's an idea that will be familiar to some of you, but for others, I found this is a really, really important insight into your parenting or into the work you do with kids in your school or program. And it's a simple story that as we're challenging kids to go beyond the status quo, to push outside their comfort zones, the support we're providing for them has got to actually move forward as well, and that if we do either one of these 2 things out of step with the other, if we do sort of pull yourself up by our bootstraps, challenge on steroids without the support, or the converse, if we love them to death without really pushing them to move forward, we're not going to get that nice developmental line that actually moves the young person forward at every step in the developmental trajectory. So that's one example of how they're interrelated. A second example, which is one that also the University of Pittsburgh researchers who came up with the active ingredient analogy also have used with their developmental relationships framework, which is somewhat different than ours, is the moment when a child takes their first steps. It's a situation that obviously most of us have lived through and many of us have helped kids through. And at that moment, of course, there's obvious emotional caring. Try getting a toddler to walk with a frown and a harsh tone of voice and no positive body language. It's not going to work. The second, though, is there's incredible challenging growth. That little brain does not yet know how to control those little legs, and there is a real fear of being hurt that the kid has got to overcome. Providing support is quite literally catching the kid if he or she falls, and those arms are outstretched, and there's a very clear sense that I'm going to be here with you. There's probably a lot of modeling of walking and some assistance before you get to this point as well. You're sharing power in a very real sense at this moment. You cannot decide as an adult when a kid is going to walk. That kid is going to walk when that kid is ready to walk. It's an interesting point to consider that in a lot of our work today, especially in schools, we decide, well, the kid's going to learn this at this moment, regardless of whether the kid is developmentally or emotionally or intellectually ready to learn it at that moment. So there's a sharing of power here that is recognizing the very young child's autonomy and control in some sense over what he or she is doing. And then finally, there really is expanding possibility. And for all of us who've been parents and had little toddlers who suddenly could do more than crawl, you realize that their entire perspective on the world had just gone up a foot and a half or whatever it would be, and suddenly the whole house or outside the house is open to them. So in that moment is crystallized all 5 of those factors that are part of our framework for developmental relationships: expressing care, challenging growth, providing support, sharing power, and expanding possibilities. So let me just really briefly highlight each of those. You can find descriptive statements in the one-pager on our website that expand upon each of these factors. But expressing care, what's critical there is showing the kid proactively that you like them and you want the best for them. And the show word there at the beginning of that sentence is critical. Kids said, they may care about me, but I don't know it. So a question I would pose for all of you in your school and program settings and also in your families, how regularly and explicitly do you express care? So there's 5 ways that came out of our work for doing that. Really being present. I'll tell you, as somebody who has got an iPhone attached to my hand most of the time, since we started doing this work, I've been making a conscious attempt to put it away when I'm interacting with my own kids or with other young people. Paradoxically, even though the teenagers may be looking at their phones all the time, they often can interpret the adult doing it in the work that we did to develop this framework as lack of focus on them. So there is sort of a double standard there, but it came out of the work we did nonetheless. So not just being present, showing warmth, investing energy and time, doing something for the kid, showing genuine interest in their ideas and attitudes, and then, again, dependability, really, really fundamental. With challenging growth, it really comes down not to you must meet this explicit standard, whether it's on your tennis team that you're coaching or in your math class or in your youth program or in your family, but saying you can never be satisfied with just good enough. You always can get better. We always can grow. So you see there that that involves a dynamic mix of inspiring, setting high expectations, pushing the kid to stretch, and then providing productive limits as those are needed. Providing support, of course, is the other half of challenging growth, and the two really do need to go together. In particular, it's critical to think about helping kids learn to complete tasks and achieve goals. And that, of course, you do that not just by telling the kid to complete the task or achieve the goal, but by encouraging them, by guiding them, very, very important, by modeling for them. There's a large body of interesting experiments in the psychological literature of trying to tell kids to do one thing but show them an adult doing something else, and almost invariably it's what they saw modeled that is going to be much more influential to the young person's ongoing behavior than what they were explicitly told to do. And then advocating for kids at critical moments. We heard about this a lot from certain young people. Not all young people talked about developmental relationships either among their peers or adults as involving advocacy, but for those for whom a particular relationship was really critical, that person stood up for me, did something to help me solve a crisis, was a very, very important factor. Sharing power focuses really on hearing the young person's voice and letting them share and making decisions. This has to happen in a developmentally appropriate way. It's not just about giving the kids sort of the keys to the kingdom and letting them do whatever they want to do. We talked a lot about the name for this category, and we worked on provide respect and hear voice and things like that. Ultimately, this is about adults sharing appropriate levels of power with young people by, first of all, explicitly respecting them, giving them voice, responding to what they say and do, and then collaborating with them to achieve goals and objectives, and then finally expanding possibilities. This was the last component of the framework that came out of the research that we did, and again, it was not necessarily something that all of the young people or the educators or youth workers we talked to highlighted explicitly, but for some people it was absolutely foundational. This teacher, this coach, this uncle, my dad got me into this program, or gave me this book, or taught me this instrument, or exposed me to help me see myself differently by exposing me to this career. And so this is about helping kids explore the world that's out there, draw connections between them and the world, and very importantly, navigate systems and situations. So, by this point, some of you may be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm struggling just to sort of keep the trains running on the track, either professionally or personally or both. And now you're telling me I have to do all 20 of those things. Well, one thing I can tell you is that we're going to be rigorously testing this framework, and if all 20 of those actions don't prove to be important in the research we'll be doing in the years ahead, we want to get it as short as we can. For those of you who know our developmental assets work, it was often a struggle for people to build 40 assets. So with developmental relationships, we've gotten it to 20 actions that undergird a developmental relationship. So we've cut the factors in half, and we're going to keep trying to make it a more parsimonious framework as we go forward. But I think it's also important that one of my favorite quotes from the composer and conductor Leonard Bernstein, to achieve great things, two things are needed: a plan and not quite enough time. The developmental relationships framework is not necessarily a plan, but it is a framework for thought and action. And so the fact that you may look at this framework and say, oh my gosh, how can I do all of those things, in our view, can be productive. The other point, though, is that it's not that every individual in a kid's life needs to do all these things all the time, but that kids need to experience these 5 factors in a relatively holistic way over the course of their development, in particular in adolescence. And so one of the things that I came up with on a plane ride in the last couple of weeks is this graphic, which attempts to say that there are circles of influence in kids' lives. It's an idea that will be familiar to many of you who have done work in education and youth development, starting with the kid and extending out into the community. And if we divide those circles of influence in a kid's life by these 5 areas, we could almost come up with a map that can give us a way to think about the role of developmental relationships in an individual kid's life. Now, in a perfect world, that should be kids surrounded by this nurturing web of developmental relationships that cumulatively do all 5 of those things. In practice, the work that we've done to date suggests that there are some gaps that kids have in their relational maps that could be productive points of departure for dialogue with kids and for thinking about the content of our programs, of our curricula in schools, and of our rituals and routines in families. So I was trying to find a simple way to depict this for this webinar, and as I mentioned, I was on a plane when I was doing it, and I discovered that there's these free clip arts that are in PowerPoint that I'd never used before, and there's this whole sort of universe of happy people that are probably mostly used for PowerPoint presentations in corporate business meetings. So I've decided, for the purpose of this webinar, to represent some key relationships in kids' lives using the free clip art in Microsoft PowerPoint. So you can see there is an individual who's going to be our visual symbol for parenting adults. It's one person, but of course it could be 2 or more. There's a farmer with a large pitchfork who is going to represent grandpa and any other family members. There are friends who are happy and kind of dancing, who will represent peers in schools, in programs, and in neighborhoods. We have the individual holding up his finger who is going to represent educators. We have this individual who is going to represent mentors. I think one of the most high potential ways to increase developmental relationships in young people's lives, and a strategy that not many schools and school districts and even youth development programs are adding to their portfolio of ways to build relationships. Community members beyond schools and programs and families, like people who live in your neighborhood or people who are just interacting with kids without a formal structure, are going to be represented by our plumber here. And then finally, we have people who work in out-of-school time programs and in extracurricular activities, so we'll call them coaches and program staff, and there we have the kind of dancing woman. So this is a very oversimplified effort to make the point about the map of developmental relationships in kids' lives. The 3 examples that I'm going to give you here do reflect actual kids that we interviewed over the course of the qualitative work that led to this framework. For purposes of illustration, I have oversimplified their relationship maps, and I'll move through this quickly because hopefully you'll get the big idea here. I will tell you that last Friday, as I was out in California and doing this workshop with a group of folks who work with young people, they began quite immediately to draw this map for the kids in their schools, their programs, or their families. And it was a very interesting exercise and an interesting way to think about the relationships in the lives of the kids they care about. So for this student, who we'll call Lisa, it's obviously a girl, age 17, she's feeling pretty good about the care she receives from her immediate family and her extended family. The family does a lot to open possibilities, to advocate for her, and really cares about what she says and interested in sharing power, and provides a lot of nurture and assistance in both school and other activities. At school, Lisa feels like her teachers really care about her and her friends care. They're also really interested in her ideas and her voice. Her friends are very supportive of her, as are her teachers. Lisa's in an out-of-school time program. We'll say it's a dance program, given the icon that I've got using there. She does feel that in that context, she really gets pushed to do things that aren't comfortable, that aren't familiar, and that they also really care about her there. She has a mentor, and the mentor is a particularly important source of emotional caring and connection, as are her friends, and that participating in that dance program and in the mentoring program both open opportunities and new horizons for her. Her friends are a vehicle for sharing power and providing voice, as is that mentor and her dance coach. The big takeaway, oh, and our plumber community member up there represents the neighbors that Lisa finds herself living in, a neighborhood that is relatively relationally rich. The big takeaway from Lisa's oversimplified story, though, is that there's not many areas of her life in which she's feeling challenged by relationships, where she's feeling that these relationships are setting high expectations and pushing her to go beyond where she already is today. So that's one potential way to say, okay, that's an important point of departure for discussions with Lisa, and if Lisa's in my school or program, for thinking about the content of the relationships we're building. So Sylvia's a much younger kid, a girl at age 10, earlier in the developmental continuum, very academically inclined, and so feeling her parents and her family members really challenge her. Feeling of emotional caring comes a lot from grandparents in particular, who seem to be most interested in her thoughts and ideas, that parents are there to provide academic support when needed, as are teachers and friends, that the staff in her school seems to be doing a great job of providing enriching opportunities, and is involved as well in some out-of-school time programs, and community members who push her to move forward. But the sectors on Sylvia's relationship map where we're seeing some possibility of need for discussion and thinking really come into that space of how seen does this young woman feel? And does she feel that she has voice, or is she mostly doing what people are telling her to do, or receiving their support without beginning to develop a sense of what we might call agency, which is really particularly critical during those essential middle school years. So for Sylvia, the simplified map might suggest that some work on emotional caring and sharing power would be productive. Final example, I'll go quickly here. Carter, age 13, that critical early teen years, feels pushed at home to work hard academically, and a family that is really pushing him to go on to post-secondary education, come from a low-income family where that had not happened for any previous generation. So very strong relational network at home, and feeling pretty good about relationships at school with teachers and peers. Same thing, in this case, Carter's out-of-school time programs were a sport, so the dancing icon there is not very representative, but got a real sense of challenge and support from athletics and from the friends that he had in that context, and in the community setting as well, in a neighborhood where there was a real sense that we care about you. The gap in Carter's relationship map would suggest that within school, unlike on the teams he participates in and his family, there was very little sense of relational connectedness in school. And so for his school, that would be an important insight to think about, and perhaps do some work with individual students and maybe thinking across the whole framework. So to recap that quick and again oversimplified vision of these 5 factors, these are dynamic. They don't all have to happen in each relationship and not all at one time, but that over time especially through the years of adolescence, it does seem that kids need to experience some mix of all of these things. So what might some implications of this framework be for your own work? Is there an area of the developmental relationships framework that you could do either more often, more intentionally, or more intensively? Very important, are kids experiencing both challenge and support in the work that you're doing with them? One of the things that we also heard about in the work we did to date was that sometimes the adults don't reprogram their relationships to reflect the fact that the kids are getting older, and that the kids want the relationships to change, but as adults we get pretty set in our ways of interacting with kids. This was particularly true in what we heard about parents, and so are the relationships, especially that sharing power component, shifting over time to reflect the kids' developmental changes. Are there people that you could add to the map of relationships in a young person's life that would help perhaps fill some of those relational gaps or intensify areas of relational interaction that would benefit the young person? And then are there negative relationships that emerge? I'll just give an example. This is actually a picture of my family. My wife and I, who was a middle school principal, merged our families 2 years ago. We both had been single parents before that. And so the 3 of the kids that you see there are mine and 2 are hers, and we've merged. And the really interesting, for us, example of this developmental relationships framework that's played out in our merged families and our co-parenting is that sharing power perspective. To oversimplify our parenting dialogue that we've been having, I have with Lauren and Adam and Victoria really probably emphasized sharing power maybe to a fault, and so there's no opinion they feel they can't offer and no suggestion they can't question. They're not disrespectful, they're not disobedient, but I have perhaps incentivized youth voice to an extreme. And I think one of the things my wife might say is that with her kids, it has been a bit more directive. And in fact, things have been, this needs to happen here and there. And one of the questions is, are they then developing the sense of agency and influence that is also really important developmentally? Our constant conclusion in kind of building this merged family is that, of course, it's not either or. That sometimes the kids that are that I brought to the family need to just take no for an answer, or need to just understand that there are limits to the power that we're going to share at any given moment and in certain areas, and the converse might also be true for the kids that my wife brought to our family. So a personal little anecdote and illustration of how this framework has really helped us find a language for thinking about our relationships with our kids. First major study of developmental relationships is ongoing, will come out in the fall. There will be a survey that we will be making available that will have an adult component and a kid component, so we'll be able to administer this for research purposes, but you'll also be able to administer it in your schools or programs or communities to begin getting data on kids' experience of relationships in the context where you work with them. And we will also be completely repositioning our Parent Further website around developmental relationships and family strengths. Beyond that, we're going to be, in 2015, going into a world that takes us beyond describing the importance of relationships. We don't want to be, at Search Institute, an organization where we mostly tell you about what a great relationship looks like, but we don't give you any practical tools to build it. We don't want to just be able to tell you why the painting is beautiful, but it's a mystery how you actually might paint the painting yourself. Because we know that if we don't give practical tools for building these relationships with kids, simply saying to all of you out there in the world who want the best for the young people that you work with, go build developmental relationships, is kind of like this guy showing up and saying, hey kid, you want to build a developmental relationship with me. It is highly unlikely to succeed. So very briefly, an example that came out of some of the research that we did to build the developmental relationships framework. We were interviewing in a large urban high school, doing some of the interviews, and we asked kids and other educators who's really good here at building relationships, and they sent us to a woman who was the work experience coordinator. And I actually was doing that interview, and again, for the purposes of time and clarity, I'm oversimplifying things, but I said, how do you do this? Why do we keep hearing that you're such a good relationship builder in this? She said, well, it's a lot of things, but I do have one technique, and it involves the way I touch base with kids. So that's why I put this picture up there. And here's what she told me. So the first thing when I get a kid on my caseload, this is the work experience coordinator speaking, I make sure I have at least a half an hour uninterrupted with them to sit down and find out what makes them tick. And the minute I have a sense of what makes them tick, after they leave the room, I literally go to a notebook that I keep and I write it down. Because, and these are her words, I'm at an age where I might not remember it with enough specificity. And I've got to write down the specific details. And then what I do is I plan a time that is not too immediately, so it does seem like I'm connecting the dots between this conversation and other conversations, but it's also not too distant in the future. And I plan a time, and what I do is I go back to that kid, and I have a conversation where I basically say, I was thinking about you and that issue we discussed, that thing that makes the kid tick. And I was thinking about it at some point when I was not at work. And she said, I make sure I tell them that I was driving my car, or I was at home after school, or I was in another meeting or something, but it wasn't when I was standing with them right there in the classroom. And then I provide them with a very specific think about, some kind of feedback on whether they were telling me that they're working on their free throw or dealing with a crisis at home or about their aspiration to become an engineer. And I go back to them with some specific feedback or question about one aspect of what makes them tick. And I'll never forget what this woman said. She said, when I do that and when it works, I've got you and you're mine. And she meant that in the best sense. Now, I should stress that that's something that would have to be done authentically. If it was sort of done insincerely or robotically, you wouldn't get the kind of outcomes that she did. But that's a very tangible tactic of the kind that we hope in the years ahead at Search Institute to capture and distill into practical resources for all of you who are working with young people. Final point, for those of you who didn't see it, a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times there was an extraordinary cover story about a young woman who was a baby who was the only survivor left in a shooting massacre that resulted in 10 dead, including many other young people. And the police, I believe sergeant at the time, who came in and found this infant and picked her up and held her in the first hours after this massacre, over the course of that young woman's development, became increasingly close to her. And recently, when the young woman was 31, actually adopted her. And there are so many things in this story that encapsulate the power of a developmental relationship so beautifully that I would encourage you to take a look at it. You can see the citation there from April 13th, 2014 on the page. But just to pick two quick nuggets that I think encapsulate a developmental relationship, and I know we're out of time. When Christina, who was the infant, now woman in her 30s, talked about Joanne, who is now a captain in the New York City Police. She said this, I can't imagine my life without her. She taught me what it was like to hope and to truly trust. If ever in life I didn't think things would work out, I could trust her, and I would just put all my trust in her, and she would get me through to the other side. And there's the article also recounts a discussion that the police captain and her husband had about whether or not, after all these years, she should take the step to adopt Christina. And the husband highlighted something else that is also a fundamental aspect of developmental relationships, and it's a point that I haven't really mentioned up till now, and it's a good one to end on. He said, this is for you too. When he was talking about creating that formal structure to the relationship, and we did see that again and again in our work on developmental relationships. It's not just the kid that develops it's the adult as well. Or if it's between two kids, it's not just one kid rather than the other who develops. So that's a quick snapshot of our work on developmental relationships. Back to those new 3 R's that we've been talking about a lot in my old world of schools. We've talked a lot about rigor, and we've done an awful lot when you think about it to raise the rigor we expect of kids. We've done some good things to enhance the relevance of what we do with them. But in our experience, it's time to bring the same level of intentionality and research rigor and commitment to our work on relationships that we've brought to the other 2 R's. And at Search Institute, we invite partners to help us think this through in the years ahead.